Bishop Banking. Our premier publication is Forum Letter. It commands the entire field of independent Lutheran reporting. There is no equal. We stand alone, and we should be proud of that. Our editor is Dr. Richard O. Johnson. He is a retired parish pastor, just like many of us, and now teaches as an affiliate professor of church history at Fuller Theological Seminary in Sacramento, California. And we are very pleased that he is going to address us now under the title, Changeless Christ, Changing World. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Johnson.
Thank you, John. And good evening. Welcome. I'm so pleased to see all of you here this evening, and so pleased to have this opportunity to reflect with you a little bit on what's happened in the last 100 years. You know, I've been reading the publications of the American Lutheran Publicity Bureau, I figured, for about a third of those 100 years. Back in 1983, I was a United Methodist pastor, and I was struggling with my increasing discontent and seriously thinking about becoming a Lutheran. My father-in-law, the late Richard Solberg, gave me a gift subscription to the Forum package with the words, "This is what you must read if you want to understand the Lutheran Church." And I quickly became one of those who say, when Forum Letter arrives, I stop what I'm doing and read it immediately. In those days, of course, Richard John Newhouse was the editor, and he wasn't exactly a stranger to me. In college, I had read Movement and Revolution, the book he co-authored with Peter Berger. But reading his reflections on Lutheranism in Forum Letter, as well as the challenging articles in Lutheran Forum, convinced me that I was making the right move, that I was, in fact, a Lutheran at heart. Here I read thoughtful writing on themes that were important to me: liturgical and sacramental theology, social concerns, ecumenism. By the time I actually completed the transition in 1984, I was a devoted and eager reader of ALPB materials. And as I began to work on this ALPB history project that I'm doing, a basic question was this: just who is the ALPB? And I had wondered that back in the 80s. I mean, the name was peculiar enough, with a whiff of a long-past era. Who anymore speaks of a bureau? And what did these periodicals have to do with publicity? And the answer, of course, is part of the original purpose and mission of the ALPB. In the second decade of the 20th century, the Deutsche Evangelische Lutherische Synode von Missouri, Ohio und anderen Staaten was pretty much living in an ethnic ghetto. Most congregations still conducted worship primarily in German. In many of the parochial schools, instruction was largely in German. A group of pastors and laity in the vicinity of New York were convinced that continuing down that road would lead to a dead end for their church. So in January of 1914, these men, and they were all men, came together at the invitation of Pastor Henry Eckhart, at that time pastor of Grace Lutheran Church in Jersey City. They met at Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Manhattan, whose pastor, John Henry Folk, would become the first chairman of the executive committee. There were several other pastors as well, and a handful of laymen who took part in that meeting. And what these men had in common was a conviction that their church needed to break out of the German Lutheran ghetto and begin to engage the wider American culture. The language issue was, of course, important, but sorry to correct you, John, but most of the ALPB founders were actually from churches of the English district, and so they were already convinced that the future of the synod lay in a steady and rapid linguistic transition, but they also recognized that language change itself was not enough, that the church needed to be proactive in introducing itself to a wider public. Their organization would be what they called a Lutheran Forward Movement, putting the Lutheran Church forward into the American consciousness, but pushing the church itself forward also into a greater engagement with American culture. In 1918, in an editorial in the American Lutheran, this was made quite clear. We are not going to indulge in lamentations because of the enforced disappearance of the German language as a medium of worship. We rather welcome the accelerated transition, and we hope to be helpful in solving the new problems with which many Lutheran congregations are so suddenly faced. Service is our slogan. But how to offer that service? Well, the initial strategy had 4 prongs. First, they would set up a lecture bureau, a cadre of speakers who would promote the Lutheran Church to a wider audience. One ambitious project, begun in the early 1920s, was the sponsorship of what they called Luther Day at a Methodist conference facility in Ocean City, New Jersey, where thousands of Lutherans and non-Lutherans would come by bus, train, boat, or automobile to hear some prominent Lutheran speaker. Well, this went well for a few years. Then it hit a snag in 1926 when Pastor Hugo Bergdorf spoke before some 8,000 attendees on the theme, The Lutheran Church and Modern Problems. And one of the problems, he said, was prohibition. It was a complete failure, and it had brought about more harm than good. The Methodist owners of the conference ground were so incensed that they banned Bergdorf from ever speaking there again. And the event itself was suspended, and then after a hiatus of a couple of years, Luther Day resumed. Most years, they found a winning formula by inviting Walter A. Meyer as the speaker, who proved to be consistently a good draw both for Lutherans and non-Lutherans. The second prong was an aggressive use of the secular press to publicize church activities. It wasn't very long before they figured out that newspapers were a lot more willing to publish articles about Lutheran churches if Lutheran churches would pay for advertisements in the papers. And so ALPB began to help congregations learn how to write advertising copy. This would be a good place to mention one of the wisest decisions that the early ALPB board made, which was to hire Julius Nicholsburg in 1917 as its first full-time staff member. Nicky, as he was called, had been in his family's dyeing and cleaning business and had taken a particular interest in advertising. There was a downturn in business during World War I, and this led him to a second career as a newspaper man. And so these skills, both in advertising and journalism, made him really an invaluable mainstay of the ALPB for some 40 years. The third prong was an active program to donate Lutheran-oriented books and magazines to libraries and reading rooms. Someone discovered that the only biography of Luther in the New York Public Library was a condemnatory work by a Roman Catholic author, and so the ALPB set out to rectify that problem. We bemoan and begroan the superior activity of Romanism, Christian Science, and other destructive fallacies, and usually do nothing to offset it, said the American Lutheran in 1920, but ALPB was ready to offset it. And one early project was to place copies of Theological Quarterly, the Lutheran Witness, and Lehre und Vera in the reading room of Union Theological Seminary, a project which one might think didn't offer much opportunity for return on their investment, but they had high hopes. And the fourth prong, and arguably the most important in the long run, was the publication of tracts and booklets, aimed both at educating Lutherans about their faith and educating others about the Lutheran Church. And you know, this was really a major enterprise in the early years of ALPB. It sounds a little quaint to our ears. Tracts? But think about it this way. Tracts were really the social media, the Facebook of the day. They were the latest technology being used to reach millions of people, and there were literally many millions of these tracts printed and distributed over the years. And as it turned out, this whole enterprise could not have been more timely. That same year, war broke out in Europe. And as the United States moved inexorably toward joining the Allies, foreigners of all stripes, but especially Germans, became the target of one of the strongest waves of xenophobia ever to wash over our shores. Lutherans were particularly suspect. After all, their founder was a German. And rumors abounded that the Kaiser was really the Lutherans' Pope, and that parochial school children started each day by singing Deutschland über alles. And since they were teaching and worshiping in German, well, who knows what treason they might be spouting. And so the German Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Missouri, Ohio, and other states found it expedient and even necessary to make some quick changes. Some of them were symbolic. The Synod dropped the word German from its title in 1917. Others were more substantive. Over the next years, the acceleration to English happened very rapidly. And the ALPB was there to help not just with the language transition, though that was significant, but the bigger task was to help the Synod's churches to turn outward and to engage the world beyond Missouri Synod Lutherans. Very early on, it was recognized that some sort of publication devoted to these matters was a must. The first stab was an occasional bulletin, but then in 1917, at the pushing of some of the laymen involved, as well as their promised financial support, the decision was made to launch the American Lutheran. It made its debut in 1918 with Pastor Paul Lindemann as editor, and for nearly 50 years the American Lutheran would be the flagship publication of ALPB. And it would, much as is the case with Lutheran Forum and Forum Letter today, be the primary public face and voice of the Bureau. And that takes us back, at least for a moment, to my initial question, just who is the ALPB? You know, the publications have always been editorial independent, which is to say that the board, while occasionally making suggestions or even criticisms regarding content, has given wide-ranging freedom to the editors. And while the magazines have never been the only project of ALPB, they've generally been the most widely known, and in the minds of many readers, they have been the ALPB. For the historian, that's almost of necessity the case for several decades of the Bureau's existence. There seem to be no extant board minutes from about 1930 to the 1970s, and so pretty much all we know about the ALPB during those years is what we can read in the American Lutheran and later in the Forum. And yet reading the magazines tells a lot. The American Lutheran began as what an editorial in the very first number called a periodical dealing primarily with the practical side of church work, with the enforced adaptation of our church work to modern methods. Well, already one can see a vision that went beyond mere publicity. In fact, in an early issue, it noted that a congregation can't be built merely by advertising. A church, Lindemann wrote, that has nothing to offer starving souls but vapid sermonettes and musical attractions is, in spite of the most expensive advertising campaign, doomed to failure and deserves to fail. Parenthetically, one might observe that a certain snarkiness is nothing new in ALPB publications. And so the American Lutheran devoted itself to an ever-growing list of matters related to practical church work. It gave advice on how to train ushers and acolytes. It offered architectural designs for church buildings and parsonages. It encouraged comprehensive stewardship programs, always insisting that there's a difference between stewardship and fundraising. It promoted and fostered liturgical worship, calling for dignity, integrity, and beauty. It encouraged a deeper sacramental theology. And it devoted itself to the cause of Lutheran unity. We can see this manifested in two ways, one subtle, the other more overt. The subtlety came in what was a clear sense that the Missouri Synod was not the whole of American Lutheranism. The ALPB was, to be sure, a Missouri Synod organization, albeit an independent one. There were periodic attempts in one way or another to make the ALPB officially Missouri Synod, but the board always resisted. And yet the Synod never hesitated to ask the Bureau to take the lead in doing publicity for a variety of projects. When the Synod established its own press committee in 1926, the committee's membership was drawn entirely from people from ALPB. But the ALPB's vision went beyond the Synod. one is hard-pressed in reading its tracts to find any reference to the Missouri Synod. Almost always they speak simply of the Lutheran Church. In 1928, the Bureau sponsored a slogan contest, seeking a slogan that would briefly state the Lutheran message. The contest publicity emphasized that this was not going to be a Missouri Synod slogan. It was one that could, and they hoped would, be embraced by all Lutherans. The contest got a lot of attention in the secular press. They actually offered as a prize a trip to Europe, so you can understand why people were interested. And ironically, the winning slogan, "A Changeless Christ for a Changing World," was suggested by a Baptist lady in Florida. In 1942, in the midst of the war, the ALPB paid for a huge billboard to be erected in Times Square. And the text read like this: "A changeless Christ for a changing world, times which try men's souls. Pray, go to church, build up your faith and courage and strength. The Lutheran Church invites you." Note again, the Lutheran Church. Nothing at all about synodical affiliation. And then there were also more overt expressions of concern for Lutheran unity. Very early on, the American Lutheran began printing news notes about Lutherans of other synods. Occasionally, and then more frequently, there would be articles by leading Lutheran voices outside the synod. And as the synod itself began cautious dialogue with other Lutherans, the American Lutheran became an enthusiastic proponent of such conversations. Articles about Lutheran unity itself began to appear in the 30s, and this concern ultimately became really a major one, with almost every issue discussing one or another aspect of inter-Lutheran relations. In 1942, in an editorial entitled "Give Space for Doctrine," a shift in concern was acknowledged. The American Lutheran, the writer began, has always been a magazine of practical church work. The time has come, however, when a universal understanding of disputed doctrinal theses becomes a practical matter. The pew as well as the pulpit must know the basic issues which are preventing the progress of the kingdom as far as the Lutheran Church is concerned. And at the same time, the editors insisted that they were taking no particular stand on controverted matters. They simply were giving space for discussion. And there was a little truth to that. The American Lutheran prided itself on being a forum for many different voices, and yet it was not shy about expressing its editorial opinion about quite a range of matters. Practical church concerns, yes, but sometimes that crossed over into questions of church politics, and of course, in the Missouri Synod, that always had doctrinal implications. For example, as early as 1932, the American Lutheran began agitating for a change in the name of the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Missouri, Ohio, and other states. The geographically specific name, the editors complained, inhibited evangelism, and they even had a specific proposal: the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. As you know, it wasn't adopted. More substantially, in 1935, the magazine began a series entitled Today and Tomorrow. The series, said the opening editorial, would deal with the challenges facing the church in the present day. Editor Paul Lindemann had been very straightforward in a memo to the editorial board of the American Lutheran. I believe, he wrote, that the church must be shaken out of its apathy, and that first of all it must be brought up to a startled recognition of its previous shortcomings, and then to an aggressive attempt at rectification. The world, in other words, was changing, and the church needed new ways to proclaim the changeless Christ. Lindemann's plan inadvertently fell into the hands of synodical officials, who interpreted his concerns as an attack on the administration of President Pfotenhauer. Lindemann denied this. We have no intention of belittling or berating or criticizing personalities. If anybody's afraid of a cold-blooded analysis, it's just too bad. And so for the next 6 months, the magazine offered its cold-blooded analysis of everything from home missions to urban ministry to education to financial administration, mostly ironic and positive in tone. The articles, nonetheless, were a clear call for changes in the practice and strategy of the Missouri Synod, and they caused quite a stir as the Synod approached its 1935 convention. Many supporters of President Foldenhauer blamed Lindemann and the American Lutheran for the incumbent's surprising defeat and the election of John Benken. And they were probably correct. A crisis point occurred about then when Paul Lindemann fell ill and eventually died at the age of 56. Some feared, likely some hoped, that the American Lutheran would die with him, but that was not to be. Abe Meyer, who had been managing editor for several years, became sort of the chairman of an editorial committee that continued to produce the magazine, and Meyer was ultimately named editor in 1953. That 1938 Synodical Convention raised hopes about the possibility of altar and pulpit fellowship with the American Lutheran Church, and the American Lutheran enthusiastically endorsed that plan. But at the same time, a conservative reaction was taking place, represented most strikingly by a group that seemed to present itself as precisely the antithesis of the ALPB, founded by Pastor Paul Bergdorf. The Confessional Lutheran Publicity Bureau published a magazine they called the Confessional Lutheran. Well, imitation, as they say, is the sincerest form of flattery, but these self-styled confessional Lutherans had nothing but contempt for the ALPB and all its causes. Indeed, to this day, Missouri's far right sees the ALPB as one of the fountainheads of apostasy in American Lutheranism. And that attitude really dates to a 1945 controversy that many of you know about, and it was the ALPB was right in the middle of it. A group of 44 pastors, give or take, gathered in Chicago to discuss what they viewed as serious problems facing the Synod. They produced what came to be known as the Statement of the 44, which, among other things, affirmed that church fellowship was possible without complete agreement on every point of doctrine, and criticized the, quote, loveless attitude which is manifesting itself within the Synod. Those of you up on your Missouri Synod history know that all hell broke loose. I can't talk about this in any detail tonight. You'll have to read the book. But suffice it to say that ALPB people were closely involved in producing this statement. Indeed, a couple of weeks ago at the Concordia Historical Institute archives, I found an initial list of those who were planning to be present. And this list was divided into two categories: American Lutheran staff and others. And, in fact, among the others were several who had also been involved with ALPB in one way or another as board members, officers, contributors to the American Lutheran. And it was in the pages of the American Lutheran that many people first read the infamous statement, where it was printed in full without editorial comment. Well, over the next decades, the American Lutheran continued to be an advocate of Lutheran unity and a generally progressive voice within the Missouri Synod. But it's important to say that ALPB was far more than simply a party within Missouri. During the 1950s and 60s, under the leadership of Executive Director Theodore Whitrock, the ALPB published a remarkable array of resources for local congregations. There was a stream of innovative stewardship materials. One of my favorites was a brochure that asked, "Am I an embezzler?" The answer, of course, being, well, maybe if you don't take seriously the call to give back to God what He has first given you. There was a well-received evangelism program called the Sharing Christ Plan. There were regular programs for increasing church attendance, mostly geared to the weeks after Easter. Another series of materials promoted National Sunday School Week. And there were the tracts. Always the tracts. The one prong of the original ALPB platform that remained pretty consistent for much of our history. But all of those initiatives really had one purpose and one intent: proclaiming a changeless Christ to a changing world. It was in the 1960s that the world changed in so many ways, and that led to what was perhaps the most important shift in the ALPB. In 1967, the high watermark for Lutheran unity in America, the Missouri Synod joined the Lutheran Church in America and the American Lutheran Church in forming the Lutheran Council in the USA. And recognizing that a new day had just dawned, ALPB made the deliberate decision to become a pan-Lutheran body. For years, of course, non-Missourians had been using ALPB resources, particularly the American Lutheran, but the board itself had remained self-consciously Missourian. Now the board did two things. First, it began to invite non-Missouri Synod Lutherans to join the board, and second, it agreed to discontinue the American Lutheran and in its place launched Lutheran Forum. The new magazine would be edited by Glenn Stone, an LCA pastor, formerly of the Augustana Synod, and it would truly be a forum, a place where diverse opinions could be expressed. That had always been the American Lutherans' policy, but now the range of opinions would include Lutherans of all the major church bodies. The Lutheran Forum began as a monthly, as the American Lutheran had always been, but within just a few years, another change was made. A statement by the board put it this way: "The last decade has seen singular changes in the life of the church. Programs which were well received now fail to attract the enthusiasm they once did." Sounds like today, huh? "Pastors and people are searching for new directions. The church on both the local and national level is in a state of transition." And so the board said, in this situation, ALPB would now concentrate on religious journalism. To meet a wider range of concerns, it would establish Forum Letter as a monthly newsletter, supplementing Lutheran Forum, which would now become a quarterly journal. This change, said the board, is in keeping with the Bureau's traditional willingness to innovate. The newsletter and magazine combination will provide fast, timely, and perceptive coverage of the religious scene. In addition, the new program fills the vital need for a forum and news source within the Lutheran Church, independent of any national Lutheran headquarters. The ultimate objective of the Bureau's work is now the same as it was in different days and different times: to serve the cause of a changeless Christ in a changing world. The newsletter was edited by Richard Koenig, a Missouri Synod pastor, but he was soon succeeded by Richard John Newhouse. Newhouse had been a contributor and columnist for Lutheran Forum almost since its inception, usually writing about social issues. And Newhouse was always interesting, often controversial. I don't think you'd be surprised to know that he occasionally caused ALPB officials just a little heartburn. The precise focus of both Lutheran Forum and Forum Letter shifted and changed over the years as editors changed, but the broad areas of concern remained the same: Lutheran unity, social ethics, liturgical and sacramental integrity, and always that independent voice that offered criticism, encouragement, sometimes chastisement of all the Lutheran church bodies. More recently, of course, ALPB has ventured into other publishing ventures beyond journalism. There have been some stabs at book publishing earlier, but those books were mostly reprints from the American Lutheran. And then in 1991, the ALPB published Robert Jensen's Large Catechism, and then the next year, Different Voices, Shared Vision by Marie Meyer, a book about the role, and some others as well, a book about the role of women in the church, which Lutheran Forum rather modestly called the most important publishing event in the recent history of the LCMS. And after that, a long stream of titles: books on liturgy, books on Lutheran history, books on theology and doctrine, on pastoral ministry, and, of course, most significantly, the tremendously important and successful For All the Saints, edited by Fred Schumacher and Dorothy Zelenko, one of the greatest gifts ALPB has given to the church in its 100-year reign. Now, historians like to stop talking before they get too close to the present because we lose perspective. And I suspect Dr. Benny will talk about the present as the foundation for which he might predict our future. There's so much more I wish I could tell you tonight, so very many important people in the ALPB's history whose names I wish I could mention. I just have to promise that there will be more to come, but let me close with one more observation. In 1993, the ALPB adopted a mission statement. Maybe there was one before, but you know, in a changing world, these things have to be updated. And I'll read just a couple of phrases. Committed to an understanding of Lutheran tradition as evangelical and Catholic, the ALPB affirms the Church's scriptural and confessional foundations in order to foster renewal with the Lutheran churches in North America. In an era in which the Church in North America must address an increasingly de-Christianized society, the ALPB makes the theological, liturgical, and devotional resources of our confessional heritage accessible and relevant to all Lutherans as well as to friends in other communions. Well, that's not how they would have said it in 1914 or 1944 or even 1964. but it really is just a restatement of what the ALPB's commitment has been all along. We serve and we proclaim a changeless Christ in a changing world. And I'll leave you with two sentences from an editorial in the American Lutheran in January of 1919, on the 5th anniversary of the organization. Paul Lindemann, recalling the Bureau's early days, said this: "We were hopeful, but not optimistic. But the blessing of the Lord and the hearty support of our friends have long since put us to shame. And it is with grateful hearts that we gaze back upon the traversed way. We can say with all humility that by the grace of God, the American Lutheran Publicity Bureau has been an agency for good in the Lutheran Church." May it always be so.